diary the first time, um, seventh grade, and it was so long ago that my mother had to give permission for me to read it from the public library. We've come a long way from that. But the original book was published in 1947 and then came to the United States in 52. So it has a long history. Um, One of the things I would suggest, and I would love to do it with a mixed group because I've read it many times, but only talked about it with women and girls and then women. But it's quite a story unto itself. There are two movies I could recommend to go with it. One is the original diary, which is of Anne Frank, which is in black and white. And the second one is called The Secret Annex, which talks about Meep and Gies, who was the employee that helped the Franks survive for the 2 years that they were hidden in the attic. Then there's another book called Eva's Story, which is a different side of the story. There were 8 people in the attic. Mr. Frank is the only one who survived. When he returned, Meep gave him the diary, and he made the decision to publish it. Uh, then he meets a lady who also had a daughter, but she and her daughter survived. And that story is in a book called Eva's Story. Very well done in the sense that Anne had survived. Perhaps she would have had the same kind of story to tell. Um, we'll move to the ghettos first because that's a major topic of fiction. I just finished Life in a Jar, which is based on the story of Irena Sendler, and we have paintings of her and books of her, and use her story with some of our student group. It's about the Warsaw Ghetto, about a woman who saves 2,500 students, children, most of them very poor, and finds a network to make that work. The beauty of this particular book is that it describes the Warsaw Ghetto in an amazingly detailed fashion with maps, which is like this as a geography teacher important for me, but also involves the fact that this is a project of children who high school children from a little town in Kansas where there were no Jews, and they were doing history projects, and 3 gals and then eventually more decided to research Irena, and it's become quite a event. They have written a play, they've performed it in many places, and it really is an excellent book. Sidebar of that would be The Zookeeper's Wife, which is mentioned in Life in a Jar, which is about the zookeeper in Warsaw who hides people in the cages. My favorite ghetto book, maybe my favorite fictionalized book for a long time, is The Lost Wife by Alison Richmond. And I give tours here, I recommend it all the time. It's about a couple who were married and lived and were taken to Theresienstadt, and then lost each other in the mess of the liberation as well as the elimination thing, and end up meeting at the weddings of their grandchildren. They've obviously each married, each had other children, thought they had never found it, and here they are at a wedding. It's quite a story. In addition to that, as a sidebar, there's a fabulous book, and it's on the screen, I Never Saw Another Butterfly, which is drawings and poems of the children who were hidden. And that's part of the story of The Lost Wife, is that these pictures and poems were hidden from the Russians who were coming. And then that whole description goes on to talk about them coming back then and recovering these. And this wonderful book is really quite special and not so easy to find. Another ghetto book, which is an oldie but a goodie, also about Warsaw. Warsaw has lots of fictionalized books. This Mila 18 by Leon Uris. That name goes back way long ago. And then a sidebar, not of that book so much, but another one called Memory's Kitchen, which the women of, as the story says, the women of, as women I guess do, exchange recipes, and they're starving, and yet they're still discussing these recipes. And it's a whole book of that story, of these recipes and these women sharing in their times and visits of a better time. One of the things about it that's interesting is the description of how to make the recipes lack a little bit in the success of making the recipe, but it's still a wonderful book. Then we'll go to transportation. And I don't think we have a section for that, but the book that I'm going to mention is The Final Journey. And it is a middle school thing, but it's one of the hardest books I've ever read because it literally talks about the boxcar journey of these people in a fictionalized fashion. And if you don't know our museum, we have a boxcar, and it's on tour and available for people to look at. But to read this story, you'll never forget the opportunity, or the lack of opportunity that they had. Then we'll go to the camps, because there were lots of camps. The New York Times a few years ago said that there might have been as many as 42,000. I probably cannot name 10, but as is on the screen, the Lilac Girls is one, relatively new. And the interesting thing about it is it was a camp for just women. It turned out there were very few, if any, Jews at the camp, but these three, the women, the Lilac Girls, their story is entwined, and it's about Ravensbrück in Poland. A pretty strong story, that's for sure. And it now has a sequel. The other book that is on the screen is The Tattooist of Auschwitz. Wasn't my favorite book, but it certainly has gotten lots of attention. And I reread it because I thought, well, I must have missed something, and I guess I did. But he also wrote Chica's Journey, which is about a woman who he knew in Auschwitz, the tattooist, but she is taken to Siberia at the end of the war for 20 years, and that brings in her story in with his. It's a really good story, and again, another sidebar of the Holocaust in another place. We have a docent here who is a survivor of Theresienstadt, and that book that's here, his memoir, is A Danish Boy in Terezin. Very interesting. We have many stories, really short books, but which are nonfiction because they're memoirs, which are well worth it. Isabella is another one of my favorites. I used it when I was teaching, and there is a child's version called The Big Lie, which is a same story, a little softer tone. And then one of the most famous is Night by Elie Wiesel. When I was teaching, and if you know the book Night, it's very small and very thin. So everybody wanted to read Night. The problem is that it's a very heavy story, and it was not recommended for lower than high school. And when you ask them the stories, the readers that picked it because it was skinny, they weren't going to be harmed by the horrified and horrific descriptions that Wiesel had. Do any of you have comments or questions regarding right now? I have an assistant here who's looking for it. No thumbs.
I would say that Life in a Jar is just an amazing book and like a must read for everybody. That's one of my favorites. And what I like about that too is that it's hopeful in that what it does to the students who brought the story to light is just amazing. Plus the fact that what Irena did. But I just think if anyone has not read that it's a absolute must read. And then there's another book called Irena's Children that's also about Irena Sendler, but it focuses much more on the I want to say group, but there's another word I'm looking for. The people that actually work together. It's a different slant. Have you read that, Jan?
No, I haven't read it, Linda. And
yeah,
but I
Children.
wrote it down. That's the thing about these books is they give you a slant, and you can read a book that's almost about the same subject and still learn. I mean, the Life in the Jar, the idea being that she kept track of the names of these children and the names that were changed to, and then buried them, so that when the war was over, she could maybe help these children reunite, which as we know, probably didn't happen during the time.
Yeah, and the thing that Poland is so well known for the anti-Semitism, but to think that this story took place in Poland and that there was this whole group of people who worked together and these families that took these children at risk to themselves is it's a positive piece that we all need to know about. And I needed to know about anyway. There's such a dark side. And the thing about the Holocaust is it brought out the best in some people besides the worst in many people.
Yes. And I guess that's what the purpose of these books is, because if it'd be all awful, like The Journey, then you probably would have trouble picking it up. I have a book that I bought years ago called The Rescuers. There is a museum in Jerusalem called Yad Vashem, a Holocaust museum, and on the property of that museum is an area of trees that have been planted in honor of people who were rescuers. So that would be under the resistance thing. The criteria to be a rescuer was that you took no money for your efforts. It's a fabulous book because it has just, I don't know how many here listed with photographs, and they've been interviewed, and I'm sure many of them are now gone, but it is a positive approach to the camps and the ghettos, because the rescuers, I interviewed a lady who was hidden 13 times by different families. So there are good people, but unfortunately, just like life, we sometimes only remember the bad.
There was a photographic exhibit. The Rescuers that book is based on this. Yeah,
I was at that.
It was at the Museum of Modern Art back in the 80s. And I went
to the one at the library in Chicago. So yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just happened to be at the museum, and there were all these portraits. Of course, now I'm a white-haired lady, but there were all these portraits of these white-haired people, and you went from one to the other, and the tears are just dripping down everybody's faces, because who even had a clue what that this exhibit was there, and there we were. So I also have that book, but that too is amazing.
It's a good one. Okay, let's go on to resistance. And there are many. I mentioned the Zookeeper's Wife because that's based on true hiding of people in the animal cages. Not too long ago, I read a really interesting book called The Paris Architect. The thing about the list that I've brought here is, and partly deliberately, was to try to not only cover Warsaw, which is a common topic, and Theresienstadt, which is also a more common topic, but Paris was very involved with resistance. And this is a fabulous story of a man who's an architect for all the wrong reasons, for all the wrong reasons in the beginning, designs hiding places for Jews in Paris. And because he is an architect and he's a perfectionist, it's really quite an interesting story. Another book that I don't have a copy of, and I better get one. It's called The Haven, and it's based on, well, really the only organized group of people, Jews that were brought to the United States and were eventually relocated in Oswego, New York. The Haven is about a thousand people's story. This Mrs. Gruen wrote how she found them, how she relocated them, etc. A sidebar: the gal who does my hair was raised in Oswego, New York. She never knew about this camp, 1,000 people. She knew exactly where it was, but never knew about it. And so now when she goes home, she finds stories to tell me. Most of you have probably read Sarah's Key, again, France. That was one that I just took my breath away when I finished the book. I had no clue it would be so harsh, but that was one I liked. Netherlands, Those Who Save Us, the Blooms. There are numbers of stories that they have written. Netherlands had many hidden children, Anne Frank starts there, and hidden people. But I was reading, I've forgotten where it was this morning, Belgium had more people hidden, fewer Jews, but more people hidden than the Netherlands. That's one of those little trivia things. The Lost Girls of Paris is about spies, American girls who go to spy. Again, not exactly Holocaust, but definitely World War II, and a very good book. Then I made the mistake of trying to read the Alice Network, which was World War I and World War II women spies. Too many spies back to back, so I put the book away. And then when I finally picked it up, enjoyed it, but I have found that too many Holocaust books all in one sitting or in one time frame is more than I can do. The Book Thief is another popular one. Not my favorite, but well liked by many. Winemaker's Wife, fun, interesting French wine, hiding in the caves, hiding the wine from the Nazis, all the sidebar stories that, and that's a French story. Kindle had a series of 3 by a woman named Granger of Ireland. And this is the only book that I have on the list, The Star and the Shamrock, of the Kindertransport. That's one of the best resistance things. England took 10,000 children. And of those 10,000 children, most of them were never reunited with their families. And so this is just a little breakaway from the children that are been sent to Ireland. And good stories.
Excuse me, but a very good story about the Kindertransport is The Children of Willesden Lane by Mona Golobeck.
Okay.
Who's a famous pianist, or was. And it's the story of her mother, who at the age of 14 was a middle 3 girls, and was a child prodigy at the piano, and was sent by her parents on the Kindertransport to England.
And tell me again.
An homage to her mother and what her mother went through. I just loved the book.
Tell me the name of it again, Renee.
The Children of Willesden Lane, Willesden, by Mona Golobeck.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And it's a story of her mother. She wrote it in homage to her mother, who became a very well-known pianist, and she herself, Mona Golobeck, I mean, they're all pianists in that family, or they were anyway, yeah.
Because the Kindertransport.
I've been reading about hidden children or true stories. Have you read 50 Children?
Yes, that's on this list.
Oh, okay.
And there's another one, 100 Children. Because
that one I don't know.
The things that were done, there were several individuals that took it upon themselves to leave their families here and go and try to get as many children out as could be. And in the case of Irena's, hers were very poor, usually the bottom of the list, but the ones that were from the Haven, and I kind of think that from the 150 children books, they were people who had some influence and some money and connections, and that's just the way life is.
Yes, about the rescuers, Yad Vashem says, a Gentile who saves a Jew saves the world. That is their motto.
Well,
because who they recognize are
yes.
not Jews.
Well, and their criteria for recognition is good. I mean, you know, the idea that no one on the list or in, you know, has took money for their efforts. There were plenty who hid and plenty who had got money from the family or from someone to help, which I'm not negating that at all, because, you know, the more the better for the list.
And also it goes through a very severe screening to be recognized by Yad Vashem.
Yes, yes, I've read that. The book, The Rescuers, talks about that screening, and it's not, you don't just walk in. That's for sure.
No.
That's for sure. There's an author whose last name is Balson, Balson.
Oh, yes.
He's written 3 books that I loved. Christina's Twins is one. The Berlin
Caroline.
Girl is another. And Once We Were Brothers. And the Once We Were Brothers one was about a story in Chicago. I'm from Chicago. So I found that very interesting because of the descriptions of places they were been. But this man really writes a powerful story. The Christina's Twins is based on one of those stories where the babies were thrown out of the cattle car and someone picked them up. And then after the war, they timed the movement of the cars and then went into that region and found these babies. Powerful. And the Once We Were Brothers, the family of the guy who was the rich, successful one was taken care of by the family of the other, and a very complex relationship story. Good one. There's a man who you probably have never heard of. I hadn't heard of him until I started reading as much as I did. He's an American, and his name is Varian Fry, F-R-Y.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yes, I've heard of him.
I've heard of
An interesting story. He's sent to Marseille, and he makes lists and writes visas for people who are on a special list. Again, the escape. Okay, Abby, we'll get you. I'll finish my sentence. Anyway, Varian Fry is one of the few Americans who did anything, and he was an employee, and he was writing visas, etc., out of Marseille, which is a whole nother aspect of that. The other Japanese version then is Sukahara, and he was a Japanese envoy in Lithuania, and he was writing visas for Jews to leave Europe, but he was on the Japanese side, and he was brought back to Japan as a problem, and he now is a hero, which shows you how times change things, etc. Okay, Abby, what is your?
One of the books is Rescue in the Philippines, and there was a group of European Jews who were able to be settled in the Philippines, and most of them survived the war, even though Japan got involved and took over the Philippines. And there was one rabbi in the group who was chosen, and I knew him personally because he became my husband's rabbi, Rabbi Schwartz. And they chose him because he already knew how to speak English as well as German. So that was one.
I know a lady who, and her family, they were Americans that were put in camps in the Philippines. Again, another sidebar story that you have to scratch a little bit to find stories about Asia. There's another one about the Shanghai Ghetto, and
Yes.
people who got visas from Sugihara and others to send them to Shanghai, and thought they were living in the most miserable, and they were, conditions until they heard about what the Holocaust in Europe had been. And she was here. This museum does incredible stuff, and it's many years ago, but she came and she talked about her experience in the ghetto of Shanghai, and so that was a good one. Anyone else?
I can say that D'Souza, the embassy person from Portugal, D'Souza
D'Souza
Mendes,
Mendes.
worked in conjunction with Varian Fry, and they basically did the same thing.
Yeah.
And he was like written out of his out of Portuguese influence and history until very recently.
And it's hard to find information on him. I don't know where I found this book. I used to, as I said, I taught middle school social studies, and I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington many times and came home with more books than I should have bought. But I think I picked that up there. And
yeah, they have a foundation now.
I was going to say that.
Oh, that's
in New York.
I'm glad that's happening. That's good. I have some survivors stories. As I taught, Ava's story, which is on the screen, is Anne Frank's, would have been Anne Frank's stepsister. When Mr. Frank came back, and as I said, he was the only one of them that returned, which wasn't the way the statistics said. Used to be, it was if you were alone, you had less of a chance. If you were old, you had less of a chance. And he was both of those things, and he survived. It's a story well worth reading, especially for those of you who enjoyed The Diary of Anne Frank. The book you were talking about, 50 Children, is featured on the screen. It's a good story, and there's another one, 100 Children. The one,
that one I didn't know.
Yeah. And it's, again, people who really took themselves to Europe to gain as much access to children and to bring them back. But the United States, we're talking about individual people, and really Britain is the only one that did the kinder transport, which was 10,000 children. So we only,
yes, but this family for the 50 children ran into a lot of problems with the official US government just to use unused visa.
Yes. And well, politics always comes in, doesn't it?
Yes.
And the United States doesn't have a real good Holocaust generosity.
No.
The other book that's on the screen now is a very unusual one. And again, the boy who was saved, Gertrude's Oath. It was a really well done story about a woman, a young Catholic woman who was a nanny in Poland, and the family was wealthy. And they asked her to make sure that he was raised a Jew. And so, and she, Gertrude, is in Yad Vasham's Avenue of the Righteous. But the story that makes it interesting too is that she takes him from Poland to Lithuania, and then the backward yards and roads to Israel. And she lived in Israel till the end of her life. And the boy that she was taking care of, well, it was quite an emotional speaker to listen to. That was a good one.
He came to the US. He came on a tour some years ago.
Yeah, did you hear him when he spoke here? Yeah, I think we all did. Those of us hanging around here.
I think he spoke at different places in the area,
Yes.
including FGCU, yeah.
Now,
Hello.
Jodie Pakult is an author that
Mhm.
who writes moving and controversial topics and not happily ever after really topics. But the storyteller is her Holocaust story of a survivor who she
Mhm.
meets and they befriend one another, and he tells her the story, but he keeps saying, but I have to go back to the beginning. So it's a whole from A to Z kind of story. The 100 Children, that author is stillborn, and then I have 50 Children down, and then here's a survivor. Oh, it's underneath the screen. Curious George.
Yeah.
Yes,
I love that story. There is
Yes.
a book that talks just about their trip.
Mhm.
Again, it has a map, so I'm always liking maps. But Curious George is a survivor of the Holocaust. And if you're looking for a appropriate children's book, there's a whole now book that it contains all the stories. This one, The Journey, is only about their trip in terms of taking the drawings and the stories, etc. That's a good one.
He was helped by D'Souza. They were both helped by D'Souza of Portugal to
Okay.
get out.
I'm going to have to look that Portugal connection in because I don't think I've read anything.
I know it. There's a foundation called the
Yes.
Susan Mendez Foundation,
Yes.
and they have programs that you can webinar because
Yes.
Astrida Susan Mendez, who was the Portuguese ambassador to Bordeaux, and he, like the Japanese guy, he signed all these passports and wound up having nothing. But every week they have a story. They had the curious, in fact, the people that wrote Curious George were saved by him because he wrote their
Right.
passports for them.
I-
And it's
I
really
saw, I've been
fabulous,
doing-
it's a fabulous webinar because every week they have all these different people that were saved.
I mean,
Yes,
I've been
I-
actually doing the Sousa
Where?
Foundation, and they actually had the author on. She was extremely interesting. So yeah, I would definitely recommend for all of us
Yes.
with the Sousa because they are incredible. It was just everything that they've done was very interesting and well thought out. And again, I would recommend to get on that mailing list.
Good. I've written it down. So
There is a book about a Polish family coming to France, and that farm called the House of Glass.
no, I don't remember that. I've not read that one either. but I will.
I forget who the author is. It's very well done, and I can associate with some
yeah,
of that.
well, of course you can. Of course you
There's
can.
also a book called We Were the Lucky Ones. And I bought that at our local JCC. So I think it was one of the books that the National Jewish Book Fair organization had approved.
Okay. I wrote that one down too because I've not read that one.
Mhm.
Lots of the books that I read over the years were ones that I could use with kids, and yet there are many of these that are perfectly acceptable from about 6th grade on. I've had several classes that were so well prepared they beat me in terms of their eagerness to talk about whatever they the topics that they knew. There's one that goes on the other side, a survivor story. It's called Women in the Castle, and it's about a woman who's a survivor of a Nazi powerful person, and it is her job after the war to help relocate the other wives of these men, and she does so in a castle. That was kind of hard for me to read, just because of my sympathies would not have been there, but another sidebar story of what, there are lots of survivors and not everyone was a Jew. There's lots now. Last how many years, I can't even tell you. There were really no non-Jewish Holocaust stories or non-Jewish European World War II stories, but that isn't the case now. And one of the best ones I've read is Dragonfly by a woman whose name, or an author whose name is Meacham. It's just a good book. And if you like it, she also wrote one many years ago that my book club also read, which was Roses, about Texas and this family in Texas. Both excellent reads, good, airport, well, we're not so much on airlines anymore, but anyway, a good trip or vacation book. Kristen Hanna wrote The Nightingale, very similar to Dragonfly. I wouldn't read them back to back, put them aside, but again, another picture of non-Jewish life during the war. Holocaust is everywhere around them, with the gathering of people and transporting them, etc. Madonnas of Leningrad is another. You're so good, Sam. Madonnas of Leningrad, it again is a sidebar story. The women who worked in the Hermitage in Leningrad hacked the art and they moved it. And I don't know if anyone really knows what mountain range they put it in, but most of the art of Leningrad, or Hermitage, was saved. Again, that was a really good story. In the Garden of the Beasts is a nonfiction book. Eric Larson has written quite a few. This one is about Germany before Hitler took power and before the Holocaust really started, and then goes through a number of years. He's a very detailed author.
I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
Yes, well, this is one of the ones that was on my list or was on my shelf, and I thought, okay, I got plenty of time these days to read it. So it's a work to do because he's so detailed. I mean, the one about the Lusitania, I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't need to read about the doorknobs and whatever of the ship, but he writes a good book, and he also wrote one about Chicago during the
Oh, yes.
White City.
White City, yeah.
Devil in the White City.
Yeah, so, and I have not read it, but I think he has a Churchill book out now.
Yes.
This book about the Garden of the Beast, I mean, you could have stopped it, if the people in America were listening to the ambassador, but they didn't pay any attention to him because he wasn't one of their cronies.
Inside group. Well, I'm not sure. And, look how many people did try to say things and did try to prove things. And, nobody wanted to listen, or nobody could believe that it was true. But the description of Berlin and the politics and the life in Berlin at this time was really fascinating, because if you look at stories about Berlin at the end of the war, it was an entirely different thing.
The book that he's just written is very similar to a book called Citizens of London. If you've read Citizens of London about World War II and the Blitz and between Roosevelt and all, it's very similar. I started to read it and I thought, I've already read this before. So if you haven't read Citizens of London, go ahead and read the latest book.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, it is, as all of his are, extremely detailed, but I mean, he obviously thoroughly researched. On the screen also is Suite Française, which is
Yes.
Yeah, but she was Jewish.
Yes.
She was Jewish. She became Catholic to get, but they got her anyway.
Yeah, I've forgotten that, but I remember the story being the fleeing of Paris when the Nazis arrived. It being the fear of whatever, and everyone was trying to get out. And the problem was there was no place to go except south, and they were running out of gas in their cars and abandoned them, etc. So
Actually, his daughter found the manuscript way after her death in a suitcase.
see, I've forgotten that. Yeah. So that's a
Yeah.
good one.
I have
There
it.
was
but I
also,
finished.
there was also there were writings about Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish diplomat who was charged with issuing the Jews in Budapest, issuing them Swedish passports for protection. And he saved a lot of Jews that way. And then there was and he went to the University of Michigan as a student. He was an architect student. But Raoul Wallenberg was eventually captured by the Russians and died somewhere in the Gulag.
Going back to the fleeing story, and I never pronounce his name correctly, but Banajian, Feast of the Skeletons. It was German citizens who were living in Poland trying to get back to Germany. What a story that was. And they, cars and wagons and all their things, and they were quite an elitist group, but making this most difficult trip. Schindler's List we haven't talked about, but I almost think that the Diary of Anne Frank opened up literature of the Holocaust, and Schindler's List opened modern, current literature. I would no, the story, it was incredible. The book was good. The movie was good. I've read stories of the only time he was good was during this whole time, but nonetheless, he did save 1,000 people. So,
But he was not the only one.
oh no,
Right.
no, he wasn't the only one, but he is on the Avenue of the Righteous. So,
Yes.
even bad guys sometimes get recognized. I have a book, and it's sort of there's a couple of books. The project that the Life in a Jar developed is as a former teacher, you just wish that you had done this and that your kids responded, etc. But then there's another book, it's a very small book, and there's a DVD, and she also has come to Naples to talk a number of years ago, the 6 million paper clips.
Yes.
Yes, I heard of that.
A very rural area, no Jews within however many miles, and they've come across the idea that they need to expand their information on diversity, etc. And this community, really, but this group of children collect 6 million plus paper clips, and then they're molded into a statue, and they get it themselves or their own battle boxcar. It's really quite a fabulous story, and a much more, it's after the fact, but a much more positive a thing, again, as a student project.
Can I interrupt for a minute?
Sure.
The school is in Whitwell, Tennessee. It's a small
Yeah.
school, a small town. There's no sign at all. We were there. I saw Susan Roberts speak several times. I brought her into Florida to speak in several communities. And the kids she has 2 youngsters who accompany her when she comes to the United States to speak. And then the other thing is, one of the youngsters in her school, they partnered with a synagogue in New Jersey, and one of the youngsters in New Jersey was being bat mitzvahed, and she had a bat mitzvah in Whitwell, Tennessee, and 200 people in the surrounding areas came to the bat mitzvah in Whitwell, Tennessee. It's outside of Nashville. We were there, and it was like a little bit over an hour from Nashville. And the boxcar was incredible. To go into that boxcar was so emotional. I'm going to start crying.
Yeah.
But it was incredible. And in the school, she has binders, over 100 binders in this classroom of stories of people whose families perished or who was saved. She has a lot of artifacts, and they set up a museum in the school. It was incredible. And to see the youngsters take on this project, who they have, I mean, as you said, there is not one there's one Jewish person in the entire town. And that, I mean, it's Whitwell, Tennessee.
Yeah.
And a German couple brought the boxcar, and these people thought Germans were green or something. They didn't know about people
Yeah.
from Europe or anything.
They're the
And there's
ones-
a wonderful movie out called The
Yes.
Pig.
Yes, there
The
is.
boxcar was donated, and they
By
brought
a
the
German couple.
boxcar in pieces, and then they had to put it back together. And the railroad there were a lot of contributions to this, and it was really an amazing trip. If you ever open up again and we're near Nashville, take the ride to Whitwell, Tennessee.
I have a friend well, and she was driving her daughter to school and pulled into the town, and I've forgotten where the key was, at the police station or whatever. And they said, oh, just go over and get the key. And then
Mhm.
look at, it's very low key. But a wonderful story again about what people can do and what teachers can do to inspire. I found
Absolutely.
the last book I'm going to mention in terms of adults maybe is a book I found here when I was waiting to do a tour, but it's called Small Miracles of the Holocaust. I would never recommend anyone read this first because it's all nice stories, all reunions, all not happily ever after because of the awful things, but Irena Sendler's story is in here, and there are all kinds. The story of how Steven Spielberg found out about Schindler's List, the book, and a great book for someone interested in the Holocaust, but not a book to read first because this is too nice. It's nice. I mean, and I'm glad it is. It was very interesting. Kind of, with mostly happy endings. I prepared some stories and etc. We have a teacher with us. Do we?
Yes,
Oh, she's here.
Mrs. Lewis.
Mrs. Lewis, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
And my students are here.
Hi. Welcome. Sam had mentioned that you are your students also online?
Yeah, so we decided they're my Zoom class. So we decided to join this. I have them from 2 to 3 every day, and we decided to join this instead for class today.
I'm glad you did. I know I have a few minutes, but I would be happy to talk to you, text you, etc., because I made quite a list of books that I thought were appropriate for middle school, and
Yeah.
and not that some of these would not be, but two of them are, reach over. Two of them are books that are short stories, and I found when I was teaching that sometimes, if something was short, that it worked better than a 200-page book. One of them is called Heroes of the Holocaust, and again, it's about resistance. And what I did is I bought several copies and ripped the pages out so that I could hand several stories to children. And then we, as a group, could share some of the things that happened in terms of rescue and resistance. And the other one, and we haven't talked about any of this today, is The Other Victims, which are the non-Jews who are also part of the 12 million of the Holocaust. And again, they're short stories and cover the gypsies and the physically and mentally handicapped and the other lists of people. Again, what I did was buy several copies and then rip them apart so that each kid could read a story. Wouldn't kill anyone to read a short story rather than it, and it gave a different view of the Holocaust. Hannah's Suitcase is a great one because a suitcase that belonged in the Holocaust ends up in Japan. So talk about a story. And and that's another student project search that went well. I don't know if you have read Daniel's story from, it's an approved book from the Holocaust Museum. Now, this goes back a number of years, but the lady's last name is Matas, M-A-T-A-S. She writes very good books, generally covered everything that could happen to someone in the Holocaust happened to Daniel, which makes it convenient in terms of a book to teach. But that was one that I recalled. Devil's Arithmetic is another one. It kind of, if you put the Diary of Anne Frank and then this fictionalize what happens to a young girl who's sent to the camps after Diary of Anne Frank, it's kind of like what could have happened to Anne when she was taken away. But as I say, I have lots of those, but I will, you and I can share that if you want.
Yeah, and we've done, I actually just took down finally. We've done the butterfly poem.
Okay.
Years we do that to kick it off, and then we make butterflies.
Okay.
Yes, there was a Holocaust museum out in Texas that was taking donations, and their goal was 6 million butterflies.
Oh,
So send them out, which was amazing. We've done that one. We've done 4 Perfect Pebbles. We've done Night. We've done.
did you find out with Night that most people wanted to read it because it was skinny?
Honestly, my kids, because I used to teach Avid, and so I used to put book choices up on the board, and we would take a vote, and then we would do the Audible, and I would borrow the class set of books from school, and I would turn the Audible on. They could sit wherever they wanted in the room, and that's what we do at the end of the year for civics after testing. Is we get an Audible and they pick a book, and we go through it, and the kids have the book in their hand, and they listen to the book and go through the book together.
Well, that's one way. That's one way of doing it. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Anyone else have questions or?
Yeah, hi. 2 things. One book is by Dr. Miriam Winter. She's a Shoah survivor. And I remember she was Polish. I read the book around 15 years ago. She came to Detroit Book Fair and spoke. And the book is Trains. It was very compelling. What I vaguely remember is the woman who rescued her, a Polish Gentile woman. She was really very mean to Miriam, but she still rescued her. It was interesting dynamic. It's very worth the read, and to hear her speak was amazing. And then, the other memory I have is Irena Sendler. I don't know if anyone here would know my friend, Dr. Renee Lichtman from Detroit. He's a Shoah survivor. He was very active in Shoah events. Anyways, he was hidden in France, and he went to Poland, and he met with Irena Sendler, and he filmed the video of her. My daughters and I went to his home. It was all in Polish, but we wanted to be there just to see the real Irena Sendler, and it was Sendler, and it was for us pretty cool to see her accounting.
Like Life in a Jar.
What's that?
What you would like Life in a Jar, because
Life in a Jar. I'll write that down.
yeah, you would. It's definitely a complete look at Irena as well as the Warsaw Ghetto, and a good one at that. So.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
And then at the University of Michigan is 2 monuments. I can only find one, but there is to Raoul Wallenberg, who someone else spoke about, because he graduated from the architecture school, I think maybe 1936 or 1937. And we already knew about him, and to see that monument there is pretty good.
Yeah, again, all these sidebars and all the stories, not just of the chronology of the Holocaust, but of this was happening here and this was happening there. And I'm sure I knew nothing about Portugal, so that will be my assignment for myself to start reading about that. But the others give you a pretty broad look at different regions, etc. And again, the Warsaw Ghetto is well known, but there are other ghetto stories as well. And Theresienstadt or Terezin is, well, it's just quite a
Can I
story.
just make a comment, please?
Sure.
I'm Ida Margolis, and I'm the chair currently of the Children of Holocaust Survivors of Southwest Florida. And I was also a social studies supervisor in New Jersey, where we had a major, wonderful required Holocaust curriculum. We pay a lot of attention to whether the book is a novel or it's nonfiction. And you put them together. And personally, I think that does a disservice. I think it's really important when people are, especially when they're teaching, and I give you, the middle school teacher here, kudos for all you've done. So that's applause to you. It's very important to differentiate if it's a novel or if it's nonfiction.
I believe in this conversation, I did mention when they were nonfiction.
You listed a whole slew of fiction books,
Yes.
including Sarah's Key and a lot of others.
Yes.
And those are books that I really would never use because of the fact that they're fiction.
Well, I wasn't saying I was going to use them in the classroom.
But I think they need to be in a separate category. If people want to read them and enjoy them and then check what's true and not true, wonderful. But they really need to know that those are novels and nonfiction, and they are fiction. Anything that says Holocaust novel or historical novel, because I've spoken to a number of the authors, including Alison Richmond, who happens to take a lot of time to make sure she doesn't have errors, whereas these other books have vast amounts of errors.
Okay. The purpose of this particular presentation was really fiction, although I added other nonfiction, and it was certainly not for the classroom. It was for the people who would like to expand their reading list, their shelf list, so to speak. So, does anyone else have a comment? I've got a few.
Yeah, there's a book that would be good for the classroom. That's a memoir, and it's called On Hitler's Mountain. I don't know if anyone else is familiar with that, but it's a story about a girl, a student who grows up in the mountain area where Hitler had his retreat, and she goes to school, and the divisions in her family and in the community of who supports Hitler and who doesn't, and then the insidiousness of trying to be tricked about turning in family members who may have made comments. It's a very interesting book. And that would be appropriate for students as well, On Hitler's Mountain. And let's see who the author is here. Hunt, Irmgard Hunt is the author of that.
Okay. Yes.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm over here, but you can't see me. First of all, thanks everybody for being here. Second of all, I've been looking at the chat, and there's, I don't know, 50 different chats, great comments, powerful comments, great suggestions, and so forth. I couldn't handle that and also the participants list. It's my fault. So wonderful job on the comments, you guys, on the chats. Tried to monitor the hands up as well, and I think we got that. Definitely not intended to be for academic research, for sure. So we definitely want to make sure we separate that idea out. These are not books for academic research. We're just about done. Anybody have one last comment? Otherwise, we'll wrap up, and thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Yeah.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank Jan.
All righty, thank you, guys. We'll see you again.
Jan.
Oh, wait, Lorraine.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Oops.
Okay, can I read the comments?
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye.